As usual, we record the sessions, so if you have to miss part of a session or you just want to revisit a session, you can go back out and watch it. I've been loading them on our online training website as well, so they should be there for some time to come. We do have limitations of how big the recordings can be and how many recordings we can have with the Go to Training interface, so I found a way to actually kind of translate them and load them on our website. So they should be there for a while to come. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I do have everyone muted this morning just to give you privacy. That way you can talk with folks at work or answer the phone without having to worry about everybody listening in or hearing. So you are muted, so no worries on that account. Okay, so two different topics this morning, both of them relatively short. So today's agenda might be a little faster than an hour and a half or shorter than an hour and a half. We'll just have to see. I'm expecting it to be, but sometimes I do get a little long-winded. I'll try not to do that today. I don't think we'll need a break if we have a shorter session. And as usual, if you need to leave and come back, you can do so anytime you like. It won't bother anyone. I won't even notice if you're gone and come back. If you need to ask me a question, there's a chat interface that I think everyone here has noticed before. Everyone here, I think, has been to a few sessions or at least one session before. If you think of a question later, or if I don't get a chance to answer your question while the session's going on, feel free to send me an email. There's my email address at the bottom of the screen, lchildress@4js.com. Here's the interface we're using today, the Go to Training interface. I've been through these slides every session, and I think everyone attending has probably seen them before. So I'll go through them pretty quickly. Here's a blown-up version of your control panel that you have access to control what you see or whether or not you can chat. Up here at the top left, the red arrow lets you minimize the control panel so it doesn't use up as much of your screen real estate. Here's the mute button that you won't really need for this session because I've already muted everyone, so you won't really have any control over that. Down here at the bottom is the raise hand button that you can use to raise your hand if you have a question or if I ask you to check the audio or some such thing. And then down here at the bottom is the chat interface. Up here at the top, I haven't had a lot of people complain of problems with the audio, but if you do have trouble with the speakers on your laptop or your computer, you can also use that telephone option. And if you click on the telephone option, you should be able to see a telephone number that you can use to call in, and you can listen that way if you have a problem with your speakers. All right, so the session today, I'm going to talk about arrays and multiple row selection, which is kind of an extension of our discussion on arrays. So our objectives for the first part of the presentation is to probably review, in a lot of cases for you guys, you might be already really familiar with arrays, but how to define an array, load and display an array. We've got a couple of options there for defining arrays as well as displaying arrays or loading and displaying arrays. We can use full list mode or paged mode. So we'll talk about what that means in this session and how to configure or implement both of those modes. And we'll also, as we go along, talk about some of these built-in methods that we have to manage arrays. We have some built-in methods, and later in the session when we talk about multiple row select, we'll talk about some methods that are part of the Dialog class that we can use to manage multiple row selection. So a lot of methods today. But to get started, we'll just talk about the definition of an array and basics on how to load arrays, define, load, and display arrays. So to start out, what's an array? It's just a series of objects that are all the same type and size. So here you can see they've defined, let me grab my marker here. There we go. So here they've defined an array A, and it's an array of integers, it looks like. Notice that when you access an element in an array, you can just use an index to access a specific element, like array A 3 with an index of 3 accesses the third element in the array. And then over here, they've defined an array of records, which is pretty common with Genero and 4GL. So with an array of records, you can still use your index. Whoops, there we go. Use your index to access a specific element, record in the array in this case, and then you can also specify a dot column name to specify a specific column in a specific element, like we see here. So you can use any supported data type when you define an array. Well, any supported data type except array, right? You can't have an array of arrays. But what you could do if you wanted to is define an array of record, and then one of the columns in that record could be a type array. So you could get around it that way if you wanted to. Genero supports up to 3 dimensions, or 3-dimensional arrays. So it's kind of a mind-boggler for me. I've been playing with multiple dimension arrays a little bit the last couple of days just to get a better feel for them, something I never had to work with when I was a programmer. But a one-dimensional array, for example, with a Rubik's Cube, it looks like they have here a cube. One-dimensional array would either be, let's say, a row going across this way or a column going down that way. So you can picture that as what it might look like for a one-dimensional array. And then a two-dimensional array might be, let's say, one slice here of a cube. So I'll just kind of draw, oops, that's not a very shapely square, but one slice. So that would be, in this case, 9 elements, right? 3 across and 3 down. So that would be a two-dimensional array. And then a three-dimensional array would include the depth. Right? So think of a two-dimensional array as maybe one slice of the cube, and a three-dimensional array then would be the different slices that make up the cube. Hopefully that helps a little bit. I find arrays kind of, or multi-dimensional arrays, kind of mind-boggling sometimes. So up to 3 different dimensions for Genero. Most of the time in Genero, with our BDL language or 4GL language, if you come from a 4GL background, we're defining and implementing arrays to use with databases. So here's an example that might look familiar to a lot of you, using an array to manage database data. So if we want to use an array with a database, right up here we're establishing a database connection with the database statement, defining a cursor that we can use within a for each loop, for example, to fetch rows from the database. And then the result set from that fetch operation or for each operation gets loaded into a program array. And then once we have our program array loaded with data from the database, we can display that data to the screen with either a display array instruction or an input array instruction. Depending on whether we want the users just to be able to browse the data, we'd use a display array for that, or whether we wanted them to be able to actually edit the data as well. And that's what we'd use an input array instruction for. So that's pretty commonly done with arrays, use them to interact with a database. So here's what defining the array would look like. So notice we've got 2 different methods we can use to define an array. A lot of times there's more than one way to do anything with 4GL or Genero. But the first option up here at the top is kind of the old tried and true method of defining a static array. So a static array you can see is explicitly sized. This one's going to have going to be an array of 5 elements. And one of the things about static arrays that might not be so great is that when they're defined, all the elements are initialized right up front. So it goes ahead and allocates memory for the elements in this array right up front before the array is even loaded. So sometimes that might be considered wasteful, right? We might not actually need all that memory allocated because we might not actually fill the entire array. We may not really need all 5 elements. So that's a static array. It has a other limitation of having a maximum size, 65, 535. And if you've worked with static arrays, you might have seen this array out of bounds error that they're talking about. Since you do have to define a size for a static array, if you try to load more rows into the array than you've defined for the size, then you're trying to load data into a non-existent array element, right? So you get an array out of bounds error. So that's fairly common, especially if you're new to working with static arrays. So an option you might prefer is working with dynamic arrays. The second method down at the bottom is the preferred method, especially for large sets of data. If you have a lot of data, the dynamic array has the benefit of not actually allocating memory until it's actually needed when we append rows to the array. So that's one of the benefits of using a dynamic array, is it doesn't actually go out and pre-allocate memory when you define the array. It actually waits until you're loading data into the array. So it's dynamic in that way. Also, notice that there's no maximum size for a dynamic array, right? We don't have the maximum size down here at the bottom describing this type of array. So it's theoretically as large as you would like it to be. So it's only constrained by, let's say, the memory that's available to your application. So variable size, dynamically allocated, right? The memory is dynamically allocated, and it allows you to fill the array with data on demand, if you like, without having to pre-allocate memory ahead of time. So a lot of benefits for that. So 2 ways to define an array. You can have a static array or a dynamic array. Now here's something else that we have 2 different options for. When you actually load the array with data or display the array after loading it with data, you have a couple of options here too. There's something called full list mode that if you've worked with arrays you're probably very familiar with, and that's where you go ahead and load all the data from the results set into the array ahead of time, right before you actually display the array. So everything's loaded, then displayed. There's another option, though, that's also good for large sets of data called paged mode. And paged mode, think of that as more of a dynamic way to fetch data for the user. So it's just retrieving data or fetching data what they call a page at a time. Now a page is kind of a flexible value or a flexible term. A page is just referring to the viewable part of the container, right? The viewable part that's on the screen that the user sees. So a page can be a varying size. But the idea is to fetch data only as the user actually needs it, and that way we may not use as much memory, for example, as we'd use with a full list mode array. Also, it lets you fetch fresh data from the database. So if there's been some changes to the data since the application started, you'll be able to reflect that fresh data instead of stale data. And again, it can reduce bandwidth and memory. If I don't actually need all the rows in the table, I don't have to fetch those rows until the user actually asks for those rows in some fashion. And we'll talk more about that here on the next page. So it is a good option for large amounts of data compared to the full list mode that most people are familiar with. So here's an example of loading and displaying an array using the full list mode to load the data in the array before we do the display. Grab my highlighter. So here we are declaring a cursor to select some data from a database. Here's one of these built-in methods I mentioned at the beginning of the session. We'll see a lot of these as we go through the session today, so this might be the first one we've seen. Clear You can see there that there's no specific class associated with that method. This is a built-in method just for arrays to help us manage arrays a little bit easier. Now with a dynamic array like we're using in this example, that clear method actually removes all the elements in a dynamic array. So that's a way to initialize a dynamic array. So it's empty. Now it also has an effect on a static array. And with a static array, of course, it doesn't remove the elements. It actually goes in and sets all the elements to null. So this particular method works with both static arrays and dynamic arrays. But of course, it does two different things depending on which one you have configured. So there we are initializing the array. And then down here's our for each loop that we're using to fetch rows of data. We're fetching the rows of data into a record that's been defined that's identical to our array. And then we're using another built-in method, append element here, to associate that record with the current element in our array. So append element for a dynamic array is going to create a new element in the array dynamically. And then right down here, this let statement is going to associate that new element in the array that we've just configured or just created with the contents of our record variable, store rec. So there's a few of these built-in methods that we'll see in this session. So clear, append element to add a new element to a dynamic array, and then the getLength method that we can use to figure out what the current element is in the array in this case, and use that to be able to assign the record, the contents of the record, to this particular array element. And then down here at the bottom, once the data is all loaded into the array, then we're displaying the array. So that's an example of full list mode. We're fetching all the rows for the complete result set before we actually do the display. Here we're talking about the other option, which is to use paged mode, or you can think of it as almost buffered mode. Instead of preloading the array with all the data from the results set, in this case we're just going to bring in the data from the database a page at a time. And again, a page is a very fluid value. It just is referencing or referring to the viewable area of the screen, whatever that might be. So here again, grab my highlighter. We're establishing a database connection. Notice one difference here with paged mode is we're defining a scroll cursor. So we use a scroll cursor with a dynamic array to implement paged mode. So our scroll cursor is going to retrieve data from the database one page at a time. And the key to fetching data one page at a time as it's needed is this on-fill buffer clause that we see down here at the bottom. On-fill buffer. Having a little trouble managing my highlighter, it looks like. So that's the key to this paged mode. The runtime system uses that on-fill buffer to fetch data from the database just as it's needed. And it's needed anytime the user, let's say, triggers that on-fill buffer by using a scroll bar, for example, to move up and down in the list. If he moves beyond the rows that we have displayed or fetched at this point, then that triggers the on-fill buffer, and it will go out and fetch additional rows to fill the page. So the runtime system takes care of figuring out when to go out and actually implement that on-fill buffer clause. So he can expand the window, use the scroll bar, anything like that will trigger the on-fill buffer, and it will go out and fetch additional rows. So here's an example of paged mode, so we can see a little bit more about it and a little more about how it actually works. Here we're declaring the scroll cursor. There's our display array, and right here's our on-fill buffer. It's very similar to, let's say, an on-action clause. On-fill buffer just means when the runtime system needs more data or determines that it needs more data, we're going to trigger this on-fill buffer, and it uses an offset and a number of rows or a length to implement that on-fill buffer. And there's some built-in functions just for that, so we don't have to do any fancy coding to figure out what the offset will be into the data, and we don't have to figure out what the length, the number of rows that we need to fetch will be. We've got a special built-in function, FGL dialog get buffer start, that we use to get the offset, and we've got FGL dialog get buffer length that we can use to get the number of rows to provide. So there's the offset and the number of rows that it's going to fetch with this on-fill buffer. It's determined by these two built-in methods. And then there's our for loop that goes in and actually grabs the rows based on that offset that we get with the FGL dialog get buffer start, and it grabs rows until it's satisfied the page size by using this get buffer length value that was retrieved. So there's how it's implemented. A few more of these built-in functions to see. So once you've decided whether or not you want to use full list mode or paged mode, we get back to the idea of displaying the array. So we define the array, we load the array, and then of course we display the array. So display array allows our users to browse a list of record. So we're using the array as a data buffer for this browse, kind of a browse operation. The other option, if we don't want our users just to be able to browse, but we also want them to be able to insert, update, or delete rows, is to use the input array. So the input array lets the users move around in the list of rows, lets them edit existing rows, add or delete rows. And then on confirmation, once the user selects OK, for example, we can update the database with our standard SQL statements, insert, update, or delete. So the modified data then with an input array is stored in our program array, and then we use the information in our program array to actually update the database when the user is satisfied. So here's an example of an input array. You can see up here at the top, we're associating a program array with a screen array that's been defined in the form. And then while this input array dialog is active, the user can move around in the list of rows, move around, insert, update, or delete. And we actually control the behavior of the input array instruction with these control blocks that we're talking about here. Now, if you were in the session where we talked about what's new with interactive dialogues, we've already discussed a lot of these control blocks, so I won't spend a lot of time on them here. But specifically, we've got before delete, after delete. We can cancel a delete operation if we're not happy with it with these control blocks. There's also the same options for insert, before insert, after insert, and cancel insert. So the example we have here on the slide is a before delete. So the before delete actually is triggered after the user deletes a row in the list, but before it's actually deleted from the list, right? So he's picked a row and he specified that he wants to delete that particular row, but it's invoked, this before delete is invoked before that row is actually removed from the list. And of course the idea for that is to be able to still access that item in the list to be able to update the database like we see here. So here, before the value is deleted from the array, we're going to access information from the array, this item number, the primary key, so that we can go out and delete the row from the database before we allow the item to be deleted from the array. Down here at the bottom, whoops, my highlighter went haywire again. There's the cancel delete. So we can also cancel the delete operation if we're not happy, for example. We've got some kind of an error and we think that invalidates the delete operation. We can cancel the whole operation. So those are control blocks that you can use in an input array to manage the behavior and also, for example, be able to use data from the array if needed before the data actually disappears because of a delete operation. So we saw most of these built-in methods for arrays as we were going through those program examples. Just to kind of review them here. For a dynamic array, we can add an element to a dynamic array dynamically with this append element method. We saw the clear method that we use to initialize an array, and it acts differently depending on whether or not we're using a dynamic array or a static array. If it's a dynamic array, it actually removes all the elements. If it's a static array, it sets all the elements to null. Here's a method to delete an element in the array, and you pass it an index to specify which element you want deleted. Here's the getLength method that you can use to get the length of an array, and it returns an integer specifying the length. And then finally at the bottom there's an insert element method that you can use to add an element at a specific position, and you pass it an index for that. So a pretty short presentation. Right? So there's an overview of arrays and some of the built-in methods we have to make array management easier than it used to be. And the second part of the presentation is on another feature, I guess you could say, of display array called multiple row select. So here on the screen is an example of multiple row selection. Let me grab a highlighter real quick. You can see over here that it looks like users have highlighted or selected multiple rows on this left side of the screen, the left array we'll call it. And he's selected those, and he's going to click one of these buttons up here to trigger an action to move some of these selected rows over to the right side of the screen. So that's been implemented using two different display arrays. Right? So here's one of the arrays over here on the left side. Here's another array on the right-hand side. And they've also used an overarching dialog statement. So this ties back to previous sessions we've done where we talked about something called multiple dialogs. So that's what we're actually seeing here. We're using multiple dialogs. We have two different display array sub-dialogs within our overarching dialog statement. And we're using special methods from the dialog class to enable and manage something called multiple row selection, to allow the users here to select multiple rows and move them right or left to the other list, the other array. There's several methods that are used to implement multiple row selection. Here's three of them listed on the right-hand side. These are the basic three. Set selection mode, we'll see in a minute, is required to actually turn on multiple row select. Right? It's a special mode that you have to turn on or off. IsRo Selected is a special method that's used to query rows to see if the selection flag from the row has been set. And then set selection range is another method that you can use to actually set the selection flag for a range of rows. A bit of a shortcut, I guess you could say. Right? So it quickly sets the selection flag for multiple rows. We would use it in this example. For example, if the user clicked one of these buttons that has the double arrows, meaning he wants to actually move all the rows one side or the other, we could use this set selection range as a shortcut to set the selection flags for all those rows to make it quicker to select them to move over to the other side. more efficient, we'll say. So there's the three basic methods. A couple of concepts that are new for multiple row selection is this idea that the selected row is different from the current row. When you can select multiple rows, it's actually two different things that you have to be concerned with. Now, the default behavior, of course, is single row selection, and we don't have to worry about whether or not the selected row is also the current row with single row selection. They're always the same thing. But with multiple row selection, it's two different concepts. The current row may not be selected. I have an example of that up here, right? The current row is usually shown as a dotted rectangle. So this one's the current row with this dotted rectangle around it. And selected rows are typically shown with a blue background unless you've done something to override that default. So these are selected rows. This one down here at the very bottom, if you look carefully, you can see that the dotted rectangle is around this email address to row. So that is the current row. So two different values, selected row and current row. They're not the same thing with multiple row select. Now this is where, for example, you would use that dialog class method IsRo Selected to find out, to query, to find out which of these rows in the list over here are selected rows. That would be the method we'd use to figure that out. So here is the set selection mode method. So notice it's a method of the dialog class. And here's an example in the code of calling that method to turn on multiple row selection for one of the arrays, right, left array. And then here's the same thing to turn on multiple row selection for the other array, the right side array, they're calling it. So two values you can have. You can turn this off or on during the dialog. So here in this example, they're turning it on by passing it a 1, which represents the mode. So that turns it off. If you want to turn it turns it on. If you want to turn it off, you can pass it a 0. So 1's on, 0's off. So one thing, if you actually do turn this on and off during the display array, one of the things to be aware of is if you turn it off after it's been on, that will automatically deselect any rows that have been selected while the mode was turned on. And here's an example of the IsRo Selected method. So this is the method we talked about using to actually query rows to see if the row is actually selected or not. So it's checking a selection flag. So here we've got a for loop, and they're using this IsRo Selected, whoops, can't control my highlighter today, IsRo Selected method within the for loop to check every row in the array, right? So 1 to array.getLength. There's one of those built-in methods that gets the length of the array. So it's checking every row in the array to see if the selection flag is set or not. Now if the selection flag is set, notice we're calling another dialog method called append row. And we're appending the row to the other array, right? Because they're moving it to the other list, moving it to the other side. So that's the append row method that we can use to append it to the other array. And then down here, a little further down, you can see that they're deleting the row from the source array, right, the array that it originated in. So there's an example of IsRo Selected. Put it in a loop so that it could query every row in the list to see if the selection flag is set. If it's set, they're appending the row to the other array and then deleting it from the source array. The rest of this is just housekeeping that they're doing to make sure that when the row gets moved, appended to the other array, that it preserves all of its attributes like the color and so on, the name and the color. And here's the third dialog method we talked about that's used to implement multiple row selection. This is the one we talked about that you could use if a user has an option or an action to go in and select all rows. This would be a shortcut to go in and set the selection flag for all the rows in that range. So here they're passing it a screen array, and they're saying all rows because they're using 1 to -1. That's all rows from the beginning to the end of that screen array, but you could also specify, let's say, values 5 through 10 if you wanted to. It's just a range. And then 1 says to set the selection flag to show that it is selected, and again, 2 values you can use. If you pass it a 0, that unselects the selected rows. So 0 or 1. 1 to select, 0 to unselect. So that's the method they'd use if the user went in and selected all rows to move over to the other side of the array in our example. Some of the other methods that we saw while we were going through those examples, and a few more we'll probably see when we go through the program. I'm going to show you the program itself, the whole thing, here in a second. I think most of these we've already seen just looking at them. I don't think we really talked about set array attributes. I don't think we saw a program snippet that had that to see, but we'll look at it in a minute when we finish the actual slide part of the presentation. But the set array attributes method can be used to define decoration attributes for each cell in the array. So you pass it the name of a screen array. You also pass it another array that you have all the attributes set in, right, configured in. So you define an array to contain the attributes, and for each element in the source array, you have an element in the, we'll call it the attributes array, that you want to use to decorate the elements in the source array. And in the set array attributes method, we'll do that. Element by element, we'll associate the attributes in the attributes array with the actual elements in the source array. That was a tongue twister. Goodness. So I'll show you an example of that in the actual studio when we're looking at the program in a minute. Append row, we saw an example of that already in our program snippets during the presentation. You can use that just to append a row to the end of a list. It's used with dynamic arrays. Delete row is used to delete a row from the list. Get array length. We saw an example of that earlier in the presentation, just to get the total number of rows of an input or display array. We pass it the screen array. And set current row, I don't think we've seen an example of that, changes the current row in an input or display array list. So that's a method you can use to actually make a row current by passing it the screen array and an index, specifying which row you want to be the current row. I believe, yes, that's the very last slide. So that was a very fast presentation compared to the last 2 sessions or so, which were very long. But let me show you the programs that these examples were taken from. Might be interested in seeing the whole thing. Here we go. The program that we were looking at for the examples on the screen is a program called ListBuilder. It's actually one of the demo applications that you can look at yourself under your FGL installation directory. There's a demo directory there that has a lot of good sample programs that you can look at. I believe we've talked about that in previous sessions. But this comes from that demo set of examples. So let's take a look at it. There we go. That's better. Had a little problem enabling it. And here's what it looks like. So this is exactly what we were looking at for those code snippets in our presentation. We have 2 display arrays. This is a multiple dialogues example with 2 display arrays, one being displayed over here on the left-hand side and this one over here on the other side. And there's an overarching dialogue statement that these are embedded in so that they're both active at the same time. That's the idea with the multiple dialogues. So that means the user can browse around the rows in this list and browse around the rows in this list at the same time. They don't have to do anything to accept or cancel one display array to be able to move into the other one. So part of this behavior we're getting from multiple dialogues. Now the multiple row selection part would be being able to go in here and use my Shift or Control keys to highlight and select multiple rows. And then I can click one of our buttons up here at the top, one of these options or actions, to move those over to the other side, to the other array. I can highlight values over here. We're still in the same overriding dialog, and move them. Oops, I forgot to hold my Shift key down. There we go. Move them over to the left side. So I'm just moving selected rows from array to array. So let's look at the actual application. Have the wrong one up. Let me grab the other one. There we go. So here they're defining some arrays. Notice we're defining dynamic arrays. Now we are going to use the method to assign this array of attributes to our source array. So they're actually defining ATT1 and ATT2, defining those arrays that are going to actually store some color attributes. You might have noticed a minute ago that the different rows in the list were different colors. Let me pop that back up here so you can see. Right, so some of these are yellow, some of them are pinkish, I guess magenta. Some of these are reddish colored, and some of them are, I guess, cyan blue versus our dark blue background. So we have some colors associated with those, some color attributes. And they're actually going to implement that by using a special method. So that's what this second set of arrays is for, ATT1 and ATT2. We'll see in a moment. So they're starting out by calling a function called fillArray, and they're passing our array that we're going to use on the left-hand side and the right-hand side both to this fillArray function, along with these special arrays that have been defined with the color attributes that we want to use for the display. And here's some of the attributes they're specifying. So let's go down and look at fillArray. I believe it's way down here at the bottom. So here in fillArray we can see we've passed in our 2 source arrays or data arrays here, one at a time. So this will be either array 1 or array 2, depending on which function call we're in. There's C, which is our attributes array with our special color attributes, or that's what it will be used for. And then the third, let's see, okay, that would be left or right, if I remember right. So left or right. M is the values, the integer value, 5 or 7, if I remember right. And then D1 and D2 were colors that they wanted to associate with elements in the array. It's kind of hard to remember from one second to the next. So here they're defining the arrays, some string values, and there's one of our built-in methods to initialize our arrays, remove all the elements in this case because they are dynamic arrays, and then they've got a for loop that they're using to populate our arrays. So they're setting the name to P, which was left or right, left for the array 1, right for array 2 when it gets passed to this function, and a dash, and then the integer value, I1 to 5 or I1 to 7, depending on which array we're looking at. And then to set the color attributes in the other array, what I'll call the attributes array, they're using a mod function to see if it divides evenly by 3, it's going to be one color. If it's a remainder divided by 3, it'll be a different color. All right, so that just fills our arrays. Go back up here to the top. So we were right here where we went down and actually filled our 2 arrays with data. Now we're in our overriding dialog statement here. So this is our multiple dialog feature we've talked about. And then here's our 2 sub-dialogs. Right? Here's the first one, display array for the first array, the one that will be displayed to the screen array on the left. And this is our second display array that's going to be displayed to the screen array on the right. So there's your multiple dialogs, an overriding dialog statement with 2 display arrays. And that's what gives the user the ability to move back and forth between those lists on the screen without having to use an accept or cancel to get out of one before they can go into the other. Now notice we've got a before row block here for both of these display arrays. But that before row block won't be called actually until after this one, the before dialog block. So in the order that it uses to actually process these blocks, before dialog has a higher priority. So let's pop down there and see what it does. So before dialog, they're calling this special method, dialog class method, called setArrayAttributes. There's our screen array that we're passing the special method, and then we're passing it the array that had our attributes, our color attributes defined. So this function will go in, and our method will actually go in and actually assign a color from an element in the attributes array with an element in the screen array. And it'll go through there one element at a time to assign those. So that's the special method we were talking about, to apply attributes. Then we have our special method setSelectionMode to turn on multiple row select. So setSelectionMode, passing it the screen array, the first one, and then 1 to set the mode to on. And then we're doing the same thing for the second screen array, the one that's going to be displayed on the right-hand side of the screen. And then here's our on action statements. So if the user selects an option to move rows from the left to the right, that's on action move 1 to 2, it's going to call a function called moveSelected and pass a reference to the current dialog to it, along with our screen arrays and our attribute arrays as well, so that we can preserve those attributes. Now before I forget, remember that there's also a before row block. And that before row block will automatically be invoked anytime, let's say, the focus is first on the display array statement, or also anytime that a user moves between rows in the list. So if they select a different row in the list or move to a different row in the list, that will also invoke this before row block. And when the before row block is invoked, it's going to call a function called setup and pass a reference to our current dialog, our current display array dialog, to that function. So here's the setup function that we were just discussing. Look what they're doing here. They're setting actions, those action views that we saw also, to either enabled or disabled, active or inactive, based on whether or not the array is empty or not, right? So if the length is greater than 0, then the action is active to select an option to move a row from one list to the other. Once the array is empty, that means that the user has already moved all the rows from that array over to the other side. Then it's going to deactivate that action, an action view, so that the user can no longer click that button to move the rows from that side to the other side. So that's what this setup function does. It activates or deactivates actions and the action views based on whether or not they've already moved all the rows or there's still rows left on one side or the other. Let's see if there's anything else exciting here to show you. The rest of this I believe we saw in our program snippets. Right, so here is this IsRo Selected. We've got the for loop here. This is the very same program snippet that we saw when we discussed the IsRo Selected method a few minutes ago in the actual presentation. One more function, this is the MoveAll function, and this was invoked anytime on action MoveAll, I believe it was called, or something similar to that. Anytime the user actually clicked the button that lets them move all the rows from the list on one side to the other side, then it invoked this function, MoveAll. And it uses a little bit more efficient method just to go in and set to append all the rows to the other side. And again, housekeeping to preserve the attributes. I think I mentioned it before, but the last thing it does is call the DeleteAllRows method. There's a delete row method and a DeleteAllRows method. Delete row was used earlier when we just moved one row or a small set of rows from one side to the other. But here, since we're moving all the rows in the list to the other side, we're using a different method called DeleteAllRows. Actually, I don't think we did get a chance to discuss that because this one wasn't in our list of methods that we looked at earlier. We saw the delete row, but we didn't see the DeleteAllRows. So now you get to actually see it in the program. Okay, I think that's good. So we did pretty well for the session today. That took less than an hour compared to a few minutes over 2 hours for the last session, so that will give us a bit of a break this week. Let me just check and make sure I don't have any questions before I let you go for the day. Everything looks good. Okay, and remember we are recording the session, so if you want to go back and check on something about multiple row select, for example, or paged mode versus full list mode, you can always come back and look at the recorded session later. Again, I probably won't get this one out there until tomorrow morning, but tomorrow morning I should have it posted the same place that you normally would go to register for a session. So a nice short session today. Thank you very much for attending, and if you have any questions for me later, feel free to send me an email, lchildress@4js.com. And in the meantime, I'll see you in 2 weeks. We have another session in 2 weeks. I'll be sending out reminders for that as well. Thanks again.